A stench of putrefaction surprised them, and they looked at some bags on the floor. That discovery would unleash an investigation into one of the most creepy crimes in history in Spain, the nocturnal criminalist. Those people immediately notified the civil guard. The person who arrived immediately at apartment 594 on Los Sauces Street in the La Arboleda urbanization was approximately 1 p.m. in the afternoon, when the officers found 6 green bags of garbage perfectly aligned and closed with duct tape, with the intention that the smell of putrefaction will take as long as possible to penetrate the walls. When they opened one of them, they saw a human torso. And when they felt the bags, they realized the presence of more human remains. The criminalistics team was present and proceeded to remove the remains, which belonged to 4 people. The civil guard did not take long to confirm the identity of the victims. September 18th, 2016, the owner of an apartment where 2 of his tenants lived, along with his 2 children, reported to the authorities of the municipality of Pioz in the province of Guadalajara, in Spain, that something bad was happening, since he had been a month since he did not know anything about his tenant and did not answer his phone when he went to the home. He noticed a bad smell emanating from inside, so he immediately sensed that something bad might be happening. After that, the residents of the urbanization complained about the smells coming from the home, but they attributed that smell to the sewers, since it had not rained for many days. But on September 20th, some neighbors decided to enter the property and find out what was going on. That's how they realized something was inside when they raised the dining room window. A stench of putrefaction surprised them, and they looked at some bags on the floor. That discovery would unleash an investigation into one of the most creepy crimes in history in Spain, the nocturnal criminalist. Those people immediately notified the civil guard. The person who arrived immediately at apartment 594 on Los Sauces Street in the La Arboleda urbanization was approximately 1 p.m. in the afternoon, when the officers found 6 green bags of garbage perfectly aligned and closed with duct tape, with the intention that the smell of putrefaction will take as long as possible to penetrate the walls. When they opened one of them, they saw a human torso. When they felt the bags, they realized the presence of more human remains. The criminalistics team was present and proceeded to remove the remains, which belonged to 4 people. The civil guard did not take long to confirm the identity of the victims. They were Marcos Campos Nogueira and Janaína Santos Américo, both 39 years old and originally from Brazil, and their children Carolina, 4 years old, and David D1, whose family were the tenants of the house. The necropsy indicated Marcos Nogueira showed 17 stab wounds, 14 of them in the cervical area, in addition to 3 wounds from fighting and struggling in the hands, while Janaína, the wife, received 2 fatal wounds that cut the jugular. Both had been dismembered as far as the little ones were concerned. They had 2 stab wounds on their necks, made in a zigzag shape, which ended them instantly. The wounds occurred in vital areas that supply blood to the brain, immediately causing loss of consciousness. Therefore, whoever perpetrated the crime was absolutely certain that they had to be killed. It was established that the bodies had been inside for at least 1 month. The apartment had been scrupulously cleaned. There was no food in the refrigerator, and there was no furniture either, since he had only been renting the property for a few months. The relevant thing about the crime was that neither the doors nor the windows had been forced, so it is very possible that the family knew their aggressor, S, either. They probably waited for them at the door and threatened them there, so the civil guard agents completely ruled out robbery as a motive for the multiple crime. For researchers, the dismemberment of the bodies of the two adults is interpreted as a signal for third parties. That is, the police believed that the crime had been a settling of scores and a way to send the message that if others did the same as the victims, would they end up like them? Well, at first they thought that the event had been the work of some hitman, and the fact that the murderer or murderers had no problem not hiding the bodies made them think that they didn't care that the murder was discovered either. For that reason, the civil guard asked the Brazilian authorities for a list of the most relevant hitmen in Brazil, to see if they could detect that anyone had been able to visit Spain in recent months. The list of passengers who arrived from Brazil at Barajas Airport in August was also reviewed. The Spanish police, in coordination with the Brazilian authorities, were looking for the perpetrators of the crime, who already had at least 1 month at large until the murders were discovered. There is another fact that is relevant. Apparently, none of the neighbors heard any signs of a fight or screaming the week the crimes occurred. On the contrary, the first thing that caught their attention was the sepulchral silence that enveloped the apartment. Since the previous days, the voices of the children could be perfectly heard while they played. In addition, they observed that no one picked up the loaves of bread that a delivery man brought to the family daily. It was also striking that they did not see Marcos when he went to the supermarket, since he was usually the only one who always showed up. These actions aroused the concern of some neighbors, who, as the days progressed, noticed the terrible smell coming from that place. So another hypothesis arose. Perhaps the crime was not committed in the apartment, and perhaps they were not facing a place of the facts, but in front of a place of discovery. One of the theories is that the family could have been murdered elsewhere and later moved to their home in the La Arboleda de Pioz urbanization. Perhaps for that reason, the place was found in perfect condition. The hope of knowing what happened was when the agents observed that the security cameras in the urbanization could have captured everything. So they requested the recordings, though. These cameras were not working, so they had to resort to other closer areas to identify possible suspicious vehicles. Marcos Campos had moved into that apartment for barely 2 months. The last time he contacted his family was on August 17th in a WhatsApp conversation. A few hours later, he and his entire family were deprived of their lives. In that conversation with his brother, Walfred told him that everything was finally beginning to take shape and that he was fulfilling his dream, which had been persecuted in Spain for 15 years. He told her that he had got a new job with which he would earn more money, and that he had just rented an apartment with a large pool. The house was very large, and his 2 children kept running through the hallways and the garden. He also told her that they would take advantage of the end of summer to prepare the 4 rooms of the apartment, so that they could soon receive a visit from their relatives from Brazil. What Wolfram never imagined was that this would be the last time he could speak to his brother. The first investigations by the police made it possible to establish that the father of the family had worked as a waiter in a restaurant in Alcalá de Henares in Madrid. Until April and July 21st, he had moved to the apartment in Pioz and was just working again. The couple, of Brazilian origin, had no criminal record, so agents from the Central Eye Inspection Team of the Civil Guard worked hard to collect all possible indications of the place of investigation. They also examined the plastic bags that contained the remains and the duct tape that sealed them. to detect possible fingerprints. On the other hand, the investigators of the case had begun to work on the social environment of the victims, for which efforts were made in Torrejón de Ardoz, mainly in the restaurant where the victim's family had worked. Residents in Brazil said that the marriage was not escaping anyone, and ruled out that it was a settling of scores, since Marcos was a good man, that he had no vices, and didn't get into trouble. Marcos had been living in Spain for 10 years. His first job there was in a steakhouse, and since then he started working in restaurants and was excited to buy his own house in that country. Still, he occasionally visited his family in Brazil. On one of those trips, Marcos met Janaída in the city of João Pessoa in Brazil. And there they had their first daughter. Years later, they got married on August 28, 2013. Then Janaída decided to move with her husband and daughter to Spain, where he had already lived for 10 years. He wanted to take advantage of the opportunity they gave him to work as a restaurant manager in Valladolid, northern Spain. In that city, the couple later had their second son, David. The restaurant where Marcos worked went bankrupt, or so they took another direction and moved to Torrejón de Ardoz, where they lived for some time. However, Marcos was not the only one in the family who lived in Spain, as a nephew of his named Patrick Nogueira had moved in with them in March 2016 to try to train as a footballer. However, the young man had a violent history, and after his arrival there were problems between the couple. They began to emerge. That's when they decided to move to Pioz. Upon learning this, the police began the search for the nephew, as they feared that they had also deprived him of his life. The Guadalajara Judicial Police managed to find his address in a property in Torrejón, which he shared with another Brazilian and a Spanish couple. Once there, they collected abundant genetic remains, although the officers could not find it. But they were able to verify that Patrick had booked a flight to Brazil and had left on September 22nd, 2 days after the civil guard found the bodies and their stopover in Portugal, and already in Brazil, they managed to see him on security cameras. Upon his arrival, he was received by a man who later could be identified as his parent, with whom he had planned a trip through Europe between the end of October and mid-November. On the other hand, the analysis of the evidence collected at the place was in progress, and they were only waiting to find something relevant to the clarification of the fact. At the scene, biological remains and a hematic shoe print were found near the property's swimming pool. And what the human eye cannot see with the naked eye was revealed by the blue star and black light. A drop of sweat on the floor of the house led to Patrick Nogueira's apartment. With the same sequence, one of her hair was obtained, as well as a fingerprint hidden under the insulating tape, with which the 6 garbage bags in which the bodies were placed were sealed. In addition, another fingerprint was found on the handle of a frying pan in the home and on one of the kitchen knives when comparing them to the databases. They matched those of the same subject, but even more intriguing was finding that the location and messages arrived on his cell phone on August 17th and located at his uncle's house. Even the transport log. He indicated that he took a bus bound for Guadalajara that day and that he returned the next morning. All this confirmed by the security cameras that recorded him on the way there and back. And where it could be established that he arrived in Pioz around 3:30 p.m. on that August 17th, when the investigators in the case contacted his family, they said that it was obvious that his footprints had been found and his ADN in the place, since he had lived with them for some time. Although the fingerprints found in the garbage bags implicated him in the crime, now the Spanish police already had a suspect. Therefore, Judge Number 1 of Guadalajara issued a European and international arrest and detention order against Patrick Nogueira for his alleged relationship with the events. According to Brazilian authorities, after the young man learned that they were looking for him, he sought a lawyer who advised him to voluntarily testify before the Paraíba police, where he also underwent blood tests to compare his ADN with the samples collected. When asked why he had fled to his native Brazil, he mentioned that his sister Hannah Nogueira, upon hearing the news of his uncle, recommended that he return to his country immediately, since he could be the next in the family to be murdered. Despite this information, the Spanish judge was convinced that this individual had some connection with the crime. There was even speculation that he might have intended to take the bodies, to make it look like a disappearance, or bury them in the yard of the house. But for some reason, he couldn't. Maybe because he thought if he came back, someone might recognize him. Suspiciously, he never alerted his father that he hadn't heard from his uncles. People who knew him by sight said that the young man led his normal life, going to the gym and returning home every day. Moreover, upon learning the terrible news, it never crossed his mind to report to the police station and cooperate with the investigation. All those actions and evidence that incriminated him were waiting to be answered. The Spanish Civil Guard would soon travel to Brazil to interrogate the suspect, but unexpectedly something happened on October 19, 2016. Patrick Nogueira arrived surprisingly and of his own free will to the Adolfo Suarez Madrid Barajas airport, and at around 1:30 p.m. he was arrested and guarded by agents of the Civil Guard, who took him to the Guadalajara command until he was placed in judicial custody. According to his words, his sister convinced him to return to Spain, since in the prisons of Brazil they could not guarantee his physical integrity when they saw all the evidence they had against him. He was convinced that it would be better to be in a Spanish prison than in a Brazilian prison. The Civil Guard had no doubt that Patrick was the person who had murdered the family. He knew the place well because he himself was in charge of finding the house for them, in addition to knowing that his coexistence with the family was not very good at this point. The investigators had interviewed friends, acquaintances, and the victim's own family, and knew perfectly well that Patrick spent too much time alone with his aunt Janaina. Mark was worried that his wife was being unfaithful to his nephew. He expressed this to his friends, and for that reason he had constant discussions with his wife, because he suspected that they were having a romantic relationship. Janaina always denied it, but Marcos thought something bad was happening. Well, one day, he was able to read a WhatsApp conversation with a friend of his wife in which he told her that her husband's nephew had a good physique and was handsome. The concern reached such a point that on one occasion he asked his boss for a day off with the specific purpose of wanting to catch them by surprise in bed. Although Janaina's WhatsApp conversations with her aunt indicated that the woman was complaining about Patrick's behavior. He said that that boy was very strange, that when he came from football training and the gym, he locked himself in his room and said he heard voices and that a black shadow accompanied him. On one occasion, she got too scared after the young man shouted at her that he would leave the little newborn out of the house because he wouldn't stop crying. He told her that if he left it outside, it would freeze or someone would take it away. On one occasion, his little daughter was crying. At this, Patrick told Janaina that they should throw her in the trash. All these uncomfortable situations due to Patrick's presence in the house led the family to move to Pioz. The excuse that they needed a bigger house to spend Christmas, the four of them moved into the apartment. However, the boy didn't take it very well and planned to take revenge for it. During the interrogation, the police asked Patrick about his relationship with his uncle's wife, and he denied any romantic relationship with her, beyond the affection he had for her. Let us know why he murdered them. He simply confined himself to saying that he knew it would happen, and that it had crossed his mind, and that he had to do it, and he only obeyed what his body told him. It was like an internal need that he had to satisfy, but this boy's behavior was nothing new to his family. Patrick was born and raised in the city of Altamira, in the state of Para, northern Brazil, along with his two sisters, his parents, Soraya and Francisco. They opened a radiology clinic and became a family of good status and influence in that city. Little Patrick was an altar boy in the church. Still, his parents always had problems with his behavior. Teachers at school classified him as a boy with a very strong and aggressive personality. He constantly got into trouble with his other classmates, and his academic performance was very poor due to the problematic environment. They had to transfer him to school. However, none of that resolved the conflicts. On the contrary, when he became a teenager, he was expelled from school. The directors requested his leave since he was a very quarrelsome person and sought disputes with both the students and the teachers. He went to parties and socialized with other people, although he wasn't very popular with girls, and in fact, he never had any formal relationship. On June 12, 2013, when Patrick was 16 years old, he was in his biology class. The teacher in that class had given him a bad grade, and for that reason they began to argue. Minutes later, while the teacher was teaching the class, the boy got up and took out a knife and in front of all the students stabbed his teacher from behind. First in the neck and then in the abdomen. When he fell, Patrick stood beside him, watching him bleed out. Because of this, he was accused of attempted murder and was admitted to a juvenile center, where he was only there for 45 days. When asked why he had attacked his teacher, he replied that he had done it because he wanted to scare his teacher, but that it had all been because he gave it a bad grade. After this event, his parents took him out of the city, and he was living with some close relatives until he reached Yao Pesao. And since he knew that Marcos, his uncle, lived in Spain, he decided to try his luck as a footballer in that country, since he had the illusion of being part of Real Madrid. His whole family thought maybe the boy. It would change once he moved to Spain. Mark received him with open arms and allowed him to live in his house while he settled in that place. However, the relationship he had with his aunt and nephews was not exactly good. He often argued with his aunt, and she had to put up with him for the rest of the day since Patrick didn't work and only supported himself on the money that his parents sent him. Ganaina was very afraid of him. Or at least, that's what the victim's relatives say. Since he said that the boy was a person of moments, he always showed a lot of anger and hatred. From one moment to the next, his behavior changed. She thought that her nephew had an obsession with him, since he often walked around in his underwear and looked at her very strangely. But what ended his patience was when the whole family left and left him alone at that moment. Everything fell apart, and it was then that Patrick didn't see he decided to murder them. The events happened like this on August 17th. In the morning, Patrick went to the gym as usual. However, he was only there for a few minutes and left. He returned home and in the afternoon took a bus from Alcalá de Henares to Pioz. He had some pizzas with him to invite his family, though. During the way, everything changed, and he felt a deep desire to murder. At around 3:50 a.m. and 5 p.m. in the afternoon, his uncle's apartment arrived. He knew perfectly well that Marcos was working and that Janaina was alone with the children. The confident aunt opened the door and came across the young man who had bought 2 pizzas minutes earlier. He told them that he invited them to dinner, and they all did so together in the garden. While they were talking, the boy searched the internet for how to kill someone in 3 seconds. After a few minutes, Janaina entered the house and went to the kitchen to place the dishes in the sink and put more pizzas in the oven, when suddenly the young man approached her from behind and stood next to her. At that moment, he took out a razor and stabbed her in the neck twice, without her having time to notice anything. He only managed to bite Patrick's hand. His body lay on the floor in a pool of blood. Later, he went to the living room where his two younger cousins were, who witnessed the murder of his mother. But being so small, they did not understand what was happening. While he commits these acts, he narrates to his friend Marvin Enriquez, resident in Brazil, everything he does through WhatsApp messages. And he even sends her some photos. Within those terrifying messages, Patrick mocks his friend and tells him that the children didn't run when they were going to be murdered, and that they were holding on to him, which made him very amused. He laughed at the children because they didn't run. After this, he finished with the little ones and placed them on top of his mother's body in the kitchen. Once this was done, he sat down to rest and kept texting his friend. After that, he proceeded to clean the place with bleach so that there was no trace of his presence left. He first planned to bury his aunt and cousins, but then opted to put them in bags and dissect Janaina's body into parts to facilitate the arrangement. When it was 6:40 H and 5 H in the afternoon, I was still cleaning the floor. And he texted his friend saying he was happy. When he finished cleaning, he took a shower, and when he left, he told his friend Marvin that he was hungry and that he was going to make himself a tuna sandwich because he deserved it. While he was waiting for his uncle Marcos to return from work, he said that if they stopped him, he didn't care because he would have a cell for him, alone. His friend, far from being frightened, followed the game. He gave him directions to flee the place without being seen. Around 10 at 3 p.m., Patrick went out into the garden to complete his last murder. When Marcos arrived at his home, he was received by his nephew. They both sat in the pool and chatted for a moment. Followed by that, Marcos invited him into the apartment and the boy followed him. When he was face to face, he stuck a knife into his neck. I wanted to cut his jugular to finish him off quickly. However, Mark began to struggle with him, but the blood loss ended him. They weaken, and in the end, I end his life of 17 stab wounds. Patrick cleaned the house again and proceeded to dismember his uncle's body and put it in another garbage bag. Patrick spent the whole night of August 17th and the early morning of the 18th cleaning the place. Once the quadruple murder was completed, he showered again and put on his uncle's clothes, since his clothes were stained with blood. At around 4 a.m., he went to bed to rest, and only 2 hours later, he got up and took a backpack with his belongings. He also took his uncle's cell phone. He sent a text message to the landlord, telling him he was going to be late in paying the rent, because there had been a drawback. He returned by bus to Alcalá de Henares at 6:55 a.m. to play football and continued with his normal life. It wasn't until they discovered the bodies that Patrick didn't see. He fled Spain to Brazil. Everything fell apart when experts found genetic traces in the bags and some utensils in the house, as well as in a container of detergent, a toy stroller, and a carton of milk. So also on floral print sheets. At the trial, the young man claimed that he did not remember anything of what happened, even when they proceeded to reconstruct the events. He didn't know for sure which had happened first. Then he recognized a plastic bag that had been left in the living room, right in front of the kitchen. Right there, he cut up the bodies of his uncles and put them in garbage bags, the same ones that could previously be confirmed. Had purchased in advance, as well as the electrical tape at trial, one of the keys of his defense was to try to demonstrate that the accused suffered neuronal damage that pushed him to commit the crime, since, according to his arguments, Patrick had affected the right temporal lobe. Consequently, he suffered brain damage, and for that reason, it was argued that the young man was not like any other person, but unfortunately, Brain damage is what determined his behavior, although that argument was much questioned, since prosecutors said that there was a big difference between having mental damage and being evil, since the entire crime was premeditated given the circumstances of the incident. When Patrick fled, he formatted his phone to erase all evidence, erasing all data, all images, and all the conversations that might compromise him. However, investigators managed to find a revealing conversation he had with his friend Marvin, to whom he narrated the way he ended one by one. With those 4 members of his family, nearly 5,848 records in the internet history had to be analyzed, 1,631 searched elements, 54 contacts, 77 calls, 24 conversations, 15 by WhatsApp, 73 locations, 36 notes, 58 messages, 600 audios, and 66 videos, and a total of 2,676 images. Patrick was described as a manipulative psychopath with an absolutely total lack of empathy and a predisposition to murder. Perfectly aware of right and wrong, he does not suffer from any mental illness, and this was demonstrated by his attempt to hide his tracks and the great pleasure that the crime caused him. He was finally sentenced to 3 life sentences and 1/4 of 25 years in prison for the murder of the 4 members of his family. The judge made the decision after the jury found him guilty of his actions, and denied that he suffered brain damage that pushed him to commit the crime. As for Marvin Enriquez Correa, a friend of the accused, he was arrested in Brazil as an alleged collaborator in the crime, since he, far from denouncing him, gave him real-time advice on what to do and how to hide the bodies. However, the police did not find enough evidence against him, and he was eventually released. And this is how this atrocious crime that it was concludes.